Galatians 5:26. For you are called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If, however, you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another. Live by the Spirit, I say, and do not gratify the desires of the flesh. For what the flesh desires is opposed to the Spirit. What the Spirit desires is opposed to the flesh. For these are opposed to each other, to prevent you from doing what you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not subject to the law. Now the works of the flesh are obvious: fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmities, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. I am warning you, as I warned you before, those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. By contrast, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against such things. And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also be guided by the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, competing against one another, envying one another. This is the word of the Lord.
It's noteworthy that I have to say in starting out this morning that this has not been an easy sermon to prepare. In fact, it's been quite emotional. Emotional because of my experience as a pastor, as a historian, as a theologian, as a veteran, but also emotional because of the realities of the world in which we live. And emotional because today, being Veterans Day, is not just any Veterans Day, but it happens to fall on the exact 100th anniversary of the armistice that ended World War I. And they say that World War I was the war to end all wars. You ever heard that? The war to end all wars. And for good reason. The First World War was, in many ways, historically, the most gruesome, bloody, and devastating war the human race had ever seen up to that point in time. Aside from the obvious battle injuries that are inevitable with any armed conflict, the First World War was also noted for a tremendous outbreak of communicable diseases and flu and all sorts of sanitary issues that caused disease and infection that killed millions of people, civilian and soldier, and they were never touched by a bomb or a bullet. It was, in fact, a war that historians are not in total agreement on, but probably claimed somewhere between 16 and 20 million human lives. 20 million human lives destroyed. And the brutality of the war was incredibly devastating. And part of it was because of the way that it was fought, the trench warfare, and in some cases years, not days or months or weeks, but years that soldiers spent living in trenches, wandering around, eating, sleeping, drinking, and living in their own filth and sewage and rain runoff and disease. It was brutal because of the unrelenting cost on civilian targets and civilian casualties. It was noteworthy because it was, in its day, from 1914 to 1918, it was a tremendously technological war in the technology of the day. Chemical weapons were developed by this time, and the chemical weapons that existed then but today have very strict treaties and international laws governing their use, were indiscriminately used back then to tremendous, devastating consequences. The machine gun had recently been invented, and it changed the course of warfare because no more did soldiers have to pretty much engage in hand-to-hand combat where you could look your enemy in the eye, but with the power of the machine gun could kill indiscriminately, dozens at a time, at a distance too far to see their full humanity. And the machine gun is only a small example, because also the First World War had the invention of the large naval guns. They could lob a shell over 20 miles and reap destruction far beyond the horizon where the sailors could not possibly see its consequence. And the sailors had another threat that was new in the First World War, and that was the threat of the submarine, an invisible enemy that could strike from below the surface of the water, and you didn't even know they were there until it was too late. And although crude at the time, the airplane was a part of the war machinery, and it had a strong psychological strength as well as the ability to rise up above and look down on the enemy lines and know where they were, where the supply lines were, and how they were operating. But the overall consequence of military technology in 1914 to 1918 was that humanity at that point in history had made the capacity to kill on a level that had never before been seen in human history. So when the armistice was signed on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour, November 11th, 1918, it ended the brutality. And the combatants were tired. It had been a hard-fought war with tremendous casualties on all sides. And it would eventually, 6 months later, be sealed in June of 1919 in the Treaty of Versailles. But the hope was, as brutal as that war had been, that it would usher in a permanent peace. The problem was the combatants involved were tired of war, but they were not really ready for peace. And that is why 100 years later, we still recognize this day, but not always in the right way. Now, truly, I have to say, as a veteran of the Coast Guard, and I think I could speak for the other veterans in this room today, that we're all proud of our service. And as I mentioned to the children, we remember a time when Americans were not proud of our service. When it was more common to be spit upon and cussed at than thanked for our service. And this is why today I find it so important that we turn to Galatians. Paul, in the 5th chapter of Galatians, tells us, you were called to freedom. Now, how many veterans are proud of the fact that we put on a uniform in defense of freedom? That's what we're about. That's what we did. And we're all behind that. Freedom is part of that American ideology. It's part of our national identity. It's part of our patriotism. It's part of our pride. We love freedom. We believe that we have the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we are proud to have that in the United States. We believe in the importance of free speech and freedom of assembly. We believe in the freedom that a just legal system and fairness provides, and we believe in the freedom of religion, and we are willing to stand up in defense of those freedoms because we believe in freedom. But Paul tells us freedom is not a guarantee. It also, though, is something that comes with a very powerful obligation. And Paul says it first in the negative. Do not use your freedom, Paul says, as an opportunity for self-indulgence. Do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence. And this is where history can really be a powerful tool of education. Let me ask you this question. What are the top three reasons that nations go to war? And you don't have to name them, but just kind of think in your mind, what are the top three reasons that nations fight wars? And as I ask this question, I've asked this in Bible studies before, I've asked this question when I was teaching history at the university, I've asked this question in numerous occasions, but most people, or a lot of people, will say religion. Did that come to mind? Religion? Religion is why we fight wars? Not everybody will say that, a lot of people do. And I say, not so fast. The real reasons why we go to war. Money is one of them. Power is one of them. And real estate is the third. I want more money. You have money in your country, so I'm going to take your country to get your money. I want to be in control. I want to have power, so I'm going to go into your country and have control over you. I'm going to lead your country the way I want it done, not the way you want it done. Or I want to expand my borders. I want bigger and better. I want more real estate, so I'm going to go and invade your country to get more real estate. Those are the reasons we go to war. But the religion gets thrown in here because those are selfish reasons. But if we're doing it in the name of God, then it must be okay, right? Yes, Carl. That kind of goes in there with the power, but you're right. Our inhumanity, our desire to just be cruel and hate. I mean, is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
The realization that others are subjugated.
Yes. And that's
It's a power thing.
it's that power thing. And it's that inhumanity. But if we bring God into the picture, I want to say, God is on my side. Then we realize that it's okay in our religious ideology. Remember, Abraham Lincoln, on his second inaugural address, reminded us that both sides claimed God was on their side. Both sides prayed to the same God for victory. Mark Twain wrote a stinging essay called The War Prayer. And in this war prayer, in this fictional essay, he describes a man that went and attended a church during the Civil War and chastised the congregation for praying for the destruction of their brothers and sisters across the Mason-Dixon line in the name of the same God to whom they were praying, and asked how presumptuous it was that they would assume that God was on their side and not the other. When we fight these wars, what we are actually doing is claiming our freedom for self-indulgence. To take money, to take property, to take lives, to take power, and doing so in the name of some higher principle that abhors war. And this was one of the critical lessons of the First World War. And Dan, I'm sure you can agree with this. The First World War ended on Armistice Day. But the official treaty that sealed the deal was 6 months later in Versailles, France. But the Treaty of Versailles, in Paul's language, was actually a treaty of blatant self-indulgence. It was a treaty that eviscerated Germany and had draconian punitive measures austerity and dehumanizing conditions that so humiliated and degraded the population of Germany that it actually became fertile soil for the growth of right-wing extremism, Nazi ideology, and the rise of Adolf Hitler. In fact, most historians would agree the Treaty of Versailles is the fundamental reason why we were plunged into World War II. And as brutal and as ugly and as devastating as the First World War was, the Second World War was many times worse. Historians, again, are not in total agreement because depending on who you look at, there's going to be different statistics because there are so many ways of calculating it. But by most accounts, the casualty, the death toll, human lives destroyed in the Second World War, a war fought because freedom was used for self-indulgence by the victors to punish the vanquished. 50 to 80 million human lives were destroyed between 1938 and 1945. Part of that was from ethnic cleansing. Man's inhumanity to man, as you said so eloquently, Carl. We all know about the Jewish Holocaust. The battlefields across Europe and the South Pacific. The unrelenting aerial bombings of Tokyo, Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, and London. And let us not forget the nuclear devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Just imagine history. We can't change the past, but imagine history. If the Treaty of Versailles had followed the path of Christian witness rather than the path of punitive power. Imagine the world's history if instead of trying to punish Germany in every way possible at the end of the First World War, we would have followed Paul's advice and become slaves to one another.
What's your favorite color?
Now, slavery is not a popular
What's
term,
your favorite?
and for good reason. When you mention slavery, the first thing that oftentimes comes to mind is the disgusting history of American chattel slavery. And that's not the kind of slavery that Paul's talking about. Sometimes we see slavery as a sign of weakness or vulnerability or victimization. And that's not the kind of slavery that Paul is talking about. This is a slavery of service, of caring for one another as God cares for us. It's a slavery that does not allow our freedom to become the means by which sin may flourish. The lessons of Versailles and of Galatians are simply this. Those who have the power to liberate must never become the oppressors. Rather, we must become the slaves of one another. Mutuality, living out of the law of love, and this is carried across Scripture. One thing that Galatians, the 5th chapter, particularly verse 14, has in common with Matthew 22:40, Mark 12:30 and 31, and Leviticus 19:18 is simply this: the law of love. Love your neighbor as yourself. This is how our freedom is supposed to be lived. In today's world, particularly after the events of the last week, we still have a world filled with anger. The rhetoric of the day still seems to be a rhetoric of self-indulgence that is lived in language of fear and of hatred. A language that says you should be afraid. Be very afraid. Why? Because somebody over there says so. It's a language born of hate. Hate that which you don't understand. Hate that which is not like you. Hate that which thinks differently from you. And it's a world of violence, from schoolhouses to houses of worship, where indiscriminate violence is destroying human lives. It's not military conflict, but it is the self-indulgence of hate, fear, and anger that is rising unchecked in a world where the world's powers are stoking the fires of hate. And it's time for the church to rise to our call to freedom and extinguish the fires of hate. To say no to the lies. The lies that all Muslims are terrorists. The lies that all refugees are criminals. The lies that might makes right. The lies that walls are safety. The lies that something is different, that means it should be feared. The lies that perpetuate a culture of intolerance and living our freedom in self-indulgence. See, for Paul, there were two distinct options. Live for yourself, that's sin. Live for God, that's salvation. You give in to the desires of the flesh, fornication, impurity, lasciviousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissensions, faction, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. That is what we are opposed to. That is what veterans have served to prevent from happening. And I want to say, I already told the children this. It's great when people stop me and say, thank you for your service. Ken, thank you for your service. Dee, thank you for your service. Thank you for your service, Dan. It's really nice. But I'm telling you this. If you really want to thank a veteran, work for peace. Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918, was not a day of thank you for those who served in uniform. It was a day when the guns stopped shooting. It was a day when the carnage ceased. It was a day when the brutality and the hatred and the bloody scourge was ended. It's a day of peace. And the true honor for any veteran is for us to become slaves to one another, that all of those things that would divide us and put us in enmity with one another may be eliminated, so that we may live in a world of peace, so that Emory and Sky and Kinley can live in a world without the threat of war. It's a day when we recognize that it is the powers and principalities that need to be challenged, not the men and women in uniform who are called to serve honorably and justly. So let us not give in to the desires of the flesh, but rather, Paul says, to live, to truly live. So we can be out of bondage and free to love, free to serve, and free to be at peace with ourselves, with our world, and most of all, to spread that peace. For that was the hope of Armistice Day 100 years ago today. And if we can learn the lessons of our scriptural heritage, if we can learn the lessons of our historical past, if we can learn what God is teaching us throughout the whole scope of human history, it is simply this. We are called in freedom to be a movement for wholeness in this fragmented world, and the best gratitude we can give to our veterans, the best we can do to honor God and to serve God, is to be slaves of one another and live in peace. For that, I simply say, thanks be to God.